So welcome if this is your first time or your third time coming to this. This is our third week in our study on Holy Envy by Barbara Brown Taylor. The book is recommended but not required. We've been kind of going through it chunk by chunk in various pieces. It's been kind of the like airplane over the book rather than the walk through the forest, if that makes sense. Highly recommend the book. It is fabulous and wonderful. And this has been our overview for the past 3 weeks. So the first week we reflected on religious practices and holy envy. Last week we learned more about the faith of our neighbors. And this week it's divine diversity and being human. And it's been really interesting because the first week I feel like I encapsulated the first 4 chapters really well. Last week we didn't follow it as directly because we wanted more of a basic knowledge of each of the religions. But I feel still like we did okay. The last 4 chapters are where the real meat of the book is, and I feel like I'm not doing it justice, but I think I say that every week. So, I'm going to do my best. I'm also incorporating some questions that have been asked for the past couple of weeks. But if you're really interested, I highly recommend the book. And I've also heard some of the leaders have been talking about potentially offering this again or making it more of a congregation-wide study. If that's something you're interested in, come talk to me. I would love to get some other voices around about what you're looking for with that, and then possibly even bringing in voices from other faith traditions to come and teach us, and looking more at a congregation-wide thing. So, with that, we've been starting each time with a question, and I'm going to limit it a little bit more. I want you to reflect on the question, what do you mean when you say human? So what were some of the things you talked about when you were discussing what do you mean when you say human? Yes. The only one with a soul. Ooh, I like that. What else did you talk about? Created in God's image. Yeah. One shared experience that we may have different religions or values, but we do share in humanity. Yes. Imperfect. It was really fun to pose this question on the interwebs. Google and I are best friends, if you didn't know that. And it was interesting to see the responses I found on there because there were 2 different veins of responses. The first one was similar to, I found relating to or characteristic of people or human beings. Okay, check. What do you mean when you say human? A human being. A person as distinguished from an animal or a space alien. A bipedal primate mammal, a Homo sapien. To have the ability to communicate systematically with gestures, posture, and facial expressions. So as you can see, there was a lot of scientific answers to that question. And then there was also these ones. To be human is to change the world as no other species can. To live the human experience and feel. Having the ability to live, laugh, weep, smile, and so on. To evolve, learn from mistakes, to grow from them and make them better. To be able to dream, learn, and hope. So that was definitely more of a philosophical answer. And as we hear, we're bringing in more of a religious answer. To have a soul or to be created in the image of God. To have shared experiences. Because humanity is something that we all share in. We cannot deny that each person in this room is in fact a human being, regardless of where we come from or who we are. And as we've been talking about the last couple of weeks, we have a quote here from Barbara Brown Taylor. Fortunately, this is something that the great religions all have in common. Whether they confess faith in the same creator God, they agree that the truth of their teaching hinges on how people treat one another, with partiality or justice, with dishonor or dignity, with cruelty or compassion. That if we admit that we are all human beings, when we look at faith traditions and religions of this world, we can kind of use this as a baseline. Each of the religions show us how we treat one another. And maybe this is our opportunity to reimagine the ways in which our own religious traditions have treated people in the past. Maybe this can be our way. The Apostle Paul talks about how he had like scales on his eyes and that God removed them. Well, maybe this is like taking out earplugs for us. Because sometimes we hear things that we don't want to hear or don't want to wrestle with. Maybe this is an opportunity to wrestle with what the Creator God looks like in the diversity of creation, especially in our human diversity. And this week I gave you homework. I know I've given you homework almost every week, but today I actually want to hold you to it. I asked you to read the story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis. And I'm going to read it for you here. As I read through this, I want you to think about, we don't hear this story very often, so I want you to think about, what are you feeling when you hear it? What are you thinking when you hear it? What are you wondering about? This might be a new story, so I encourage you to embrace it with me. So I'll read it. Let it settle. If it arises something in you, if you want to share that, please do, but we'll talk about it a little bit more. So Genesis 11. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which mortals had built. And the Lord said, "Look, they are one people, and they all have one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language there, so that they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. It's an interesting story, isn't it? How many of you have heard that story before? Okay, a good portion. That's good. At church, when we only preach on the Gospels, it's hard to hear this story because it's from Genesis, so that's good to know. What did you feel? Think, wonder. Or maybe how have you interpreted it when you've heard it before? So you saw that we all started out the same, one language, one people, and you don't understand why God scattered everybody. Yeah. Yes. The story you remember was they weren't just building the tower, they were building the tower to heaven. They were building the tower to have more closeness to God in a way that's not good. All right, I thought I saw some hands over here. I'm going to let that linger a little bit. I'm not ignoring it. I'm letting it linger. Yes. So God created the diversity that there is and wanted people to be spread throughout creation. And honoring that diversity in the different languages. So to treat somebody differently because they speak a different language is in the face of what God intended. All right, I need to rephrase that into the microphone so I can say that. So there was one language, and then after this there was division, and then communication became a whole lot harder. And even as we travel now, when we speak different languages, it's much harder to communicate. Did I encapsulate that well? All right, yes. Oh, did God change the colors of our skin is a wondering. That's a great wondering. All right, last one. So thinking of it as a Genesis story of how God created them as good, and then the human beings kind of messed up a little bit. And so they were getting more proud because they were one people and they were building this tower and wanted to be like God. And then God had to say, nope, that's not what I meant. I like to call that cycle the gospel according to Burger King, where God says that everything is good, and then people go, okay, this is great. And then people start to get really proud, and they start thinking, well, I can do this on my own. And God says, no, you need me. And they go, no, I think we got this. We can do this. We can build this city. We can build this tower. And God says, fine, have it your way. Hence the Burger King reference. And that's when everything falls apart. And then they begin to realize, oh, we really needed God. And then God always comes to the rescue. It may not always look the way we want it to, but God is always present in that. And it's the cyclical nature throughout the Bible, constantly. So, great observations. One of the ways that this has traditionally been told is that human beings kind of screwed up a little bit. That they started to think about their own needs and desires above God's, and that God kind of punishes them to slow down. So if we look back at the beginning of this story, and then one of the gifts of the Jewish tradition, I should pause here, one of the gifts of the Jewish tradition is called a midrash. Does anybody know what a midrash is? It's a form of storytelling. It's the ability to look at Scripture and to fill in some of the gaps. To look at the Scripture and to see what God could possibly be doing in there. So in the book, Barbara Brown Taylor offers a midrash of this story that we'll get into here. And I'm going to try to hold what has traditionally been told with the story of the midrash. But maybe it'll open our eyes to why this text matters for this, what we're talking about. So if we go back to the first section of it, we notice how they all spoke the same language, and that the storyteller shows them all in agreement. But do you notice what big word shows up twice in this? Ourselves. Let us build this tower for ourselves. Let us become one so that way we can do this all together and build this tower and this city for ourselves so we don't have to encounter anything else in creation. One of the ways the Midrash showed this is that the detail to the brick and the mortar that they use. That these people were so set on building this city and this tower that brick became the most important element in their lives. That when a brick would fall from there, that they would create day and night and continue to build and build, and when the brick would fall and break, they would weep. They would cry over the lost brick. But if a person fell in the production line, no one would notice. This is not humanity at its finest. But it is encompassing part of our human nature. How often do we put the things that we create or the productivity that we do above God or above other human beings? How often do we place things above what we actually believe to be true? So then the Lord comes down, and God is, as you can see, not pleased at the work that they've done. Notice how they didn't consult God first. They didn't ask God, oh God, should we do this? Is this something that is good for you, for our lives together? And they may be working together, but is it necessarily good? And then half of the city that is built is left in shambles, and their unity is in tatters. And from that point on, humanity becomes that story of the divided tribes and nations who have lost the ability to understand each other because in a way they've disobeyed God to some extent. If you know the English word for the English word babble, like babies babbling, where do you think it comes from? Kind of fun. Let's see here. So one of the ways that this has traditionally been told is a story of God's judgment on diversity. But what if instead we saw this story as God's judgment on the dominance of one people? The people who loved bricks more than people. Maybe this is a story of God's judgment on that rather than on a diverse land. A story of a judgment on the dominance of one people with one language who wished to make a name for themselves. So maybe instead of seeing the scattering as bad, God actually saved them by confusing their language so that they could not complete a project of domination in the land. It's a different way to look at it. In this retelling of the story, the moral becomes one where God favors diversity of many people over the dominance of one people towards others. And if we read it this way, the people are revealed, there's something revealed to the people that is really important. Any guesses at what that is? It's God. God can be revealed to the people in more ways than just the brick of the tower that they would build to this God that they don't actually have a relationship with. By confusing their language, they have the ability to realize that there's more than one way to say something important. Maybe the way they say God is Brahman. Maybe it's Yahweh. Maybe it's the Holy Spirit. Maybe it's Allah. And sometimes when we use words like these that describe God, maybe they're pointing at the same thing, and maybe sometimes they're not. But if we think about the time that it takes to explain the words that we mean, we've been looking at this for 3 weeks and we've barely scratched the surface. But maybe it slows us down just long enough to think about what we're actually trying to say. And brings us back to that question of, what do you mean when you say God? That wasn't a problem that they had when they all understood each other. They had just assumed that they all meant the same thing, that they were all working for the same thing. But that might not have been the case at all. Speaking the same language allowed them to cling to an illusion. And how often do we do that? When we think that the other person is saying the same thing we are or agreeing with us completely, and they're really not. There are ways that we behave that are different than what we actually believe. Or we agree with somebody to be nice and not actually believing it fully. I also think about people's listening faces. So majority of people have really angry listening faces. And it takes me a lot of work to realize that you're not all really angry with me right now. But eventually, people began to understand, especially the people in this story, began to understand that not everything could be said in words. And maybe that can be our takeaway from this story too, that some things are better expressed through emotions or actions. Maybe a lifted eyebrow or a tilted head, a hand reaching out to put something in another hand. And it also helps us to slow down and realize, what does it mean when we say human? And how do we treat our other human beings versus the other things in our lives? Well, and it's one interpretation, and you don't have to agree with me. I will not be offended if you say, nope, that's not it, not at all. But I'd love to have that conversation. I'd love to hear where you're coming from and to talk about each of our viewpoints without having to agree. That's one of the beauty of Scripture and it being a living word and how it works in our lives. And the question that this Scripture also poses is, does church ever feel like a Babel experience? Not God, not individual faith, but the traditions of church. The traditions of being in a church. Maybe here, maybe in your experiences elsewhere. Do we ever try to make it uniform? Do we ever assume that people have to follow the ways we do things if they enter these doors? And it's not necessarily wrong or bad, but does it serve God then if we're not listening to one another? Or if we're making assumptions of one another? Because we know that the gospel according to Burger King, humans will continue to be humans. We will always continue to screw up. It's part of our nature. It's part of that not being God aspect in us, which always leads us as Christians to Christ. And maybe what this story is calling us to do is calling us to break out of our ways that we turn into Babel and to be more open and understanding of other cultures, of other races, of other languages, of other generations. This is where the gift of holy envy comes in. It allows us to relook at our own traditions in a new light. Maybe to see the ways that we have blocked out other voices. Maybe to hear how other voices have interpreted them. And this is a gift to be able to reimagine our own traditions. And gives us the ability to hopefully begin to eliminate fear and anxiety. And also look at the ways that we evangelize. I know the first week we talked about evangelism as a really important element of Christianity, and there was a lot of wrestling with that, and I let it sit there. But today we're going to talk about it a little bit, but first we're going to start with fear. As we saw in the story of the Tower of Babel, human nature, while being created in God's image and good, is still flawed. When left to our own devices, we will always err on the side of self-preservation. We see it from time and time again. And I was asked a really great question after our first session, one that I have been wrestling with, and I don't have a concrete answer for, but I'm going to pose it to you as well. Someone asked, what do we do about the jihadists and other confused souls of the world who believe their violence against others is in the name of Allah or God? Who in fact believe their crimes against other humans are the very acts that will vault them into paradise. If the premise is no religion is superior to one another, then how do we talk ourselves into the right to pass judgment? Is it an eye for an eye? And that doesn't seem a whole lot like love. It's a powerful question, and I want to give the caveat that it's not just jihadists. Hitler was in power in the name of Christianity. Charlottesville was in the name of Christianity against our colored brothers and sisters. Christianity is not innocent in all of this, despite what we may see in the media. That's just the dominant religion of our land, and this is the lens through which we see things. So I don't have answers. I don't think that us playing God ever leads to anything good, and leading towards judgment of any kind is ever good. But we also want killing to stop. And people have made choices, hopefully not in the name of religion, to do the things that they do. But it leads to something that is deeply ingrained in each of us. It points to our brokenness of humanity and how we create us versus them dichotomies. That's the story of Babel. They wanted to be one people of one language so that they could band together because it was one tribe of people. And God said no. God said, actually, you should love one another as human beings. And so you're going to be scattered and you're going to have different languages, so that way it'll take you time to really learn how to love one another. Because love is not easy. And Barbara Brown Taylor refers to a theologian named Jonathan Sacks. He's a British theologian. And he talks about how it's not our religious impulses that make us, or it's not our religion that makes us violent. Instead, it's our penchant for violence that gives rise to our religious impulses, no matter which tradition we come from. It's neither our secularism nor our religion that fuels our violence, but our fundamental groupishness. That when we band together as an us versus them group, we don't always make the best decisions. He goes on to say the common human values are great, but when our groupishness sets in and we are looking for excuses to wipe each other out, what we need are stories from deep within our own traditions to show us another way. From deep within our religion that remind us of this love that we're talking about. And I love that he says in this quote that the greatest single antidote to violence is conversation. Speaking our fears, listening to the fears of others, and that sharing of vulnerabilities discovers the genesis of hope. You still have to maintain an open mind when you're in conversation. Absolutely. It's not about talking at somebody, it's about talking with somebody. Yeah. By shifting our view of how God works in relation to other religions, maybe we can be a little bit more open in our conversations and more open to love. And I think that's what she's getting at with when we talked about that Copernican revolution of God being at the center, then the religions being the planets that orbit the sun, is that maybe it needs to be a revolution of love. And the key to loving God, or loving this higher power, I think resides in 3 places. You have to begin by loving yourself. And I say that not as bubble baths and lattes or self-soothing type things, but to do the real deep work of working through your own wounds. We're human beings. We have brokenness and maybe trauma in our lives. And if we don't do that work to love ourselves through those moments, then how are we ever going to love anybody else? It's like that airplane metaphor. If the oxygen mask comes down, you put yours on first before you can help another. And I say that because loving ourselves is something we're really not good at, especially as females. That a patriarchal society has told us that either our feelings don't matter or we have to care for others. And yes, there have been some changes in that. And yes, some are better than it than others. But loving yourself, for females and for males, takes a whole lot of work. And it's not easy, and it takes time. And once we love ourselves and we are able to live fully into who God created us to be, then we can look at loving our neighbors. We can look at loving the people who are similar to us and who are different than us, who are next to us and who are far from us. And also, we may be able to start to look at what it means to love our enemies. This doesn't mean like forgiving and forgetting. You should never forget. But what does the role of forgiveness look like? And when all 3 of these are in play, because you can't have one without the other. I mean, if you only loved yourself, well, that's narcissism. That doesn't get us anywhere. If you only loved your neighbors and not yourself, that feels a little bit like envy or jealousy a little bit. And if you only loved your enemies without loving yourself, well, that might not lead to good things. So all 3 of these need to be in play, and when they are, that's what loving God can look like. Because we love God through loving one another, that greatest commandment, that golden rule. There's a really great TED Talk that I really wanted to show today, but it's about 30 minutes long, and well, I'm already over time, as we can see here. It's by Valerie Carr, so it's Valarie Kaur is her name, and she is from the Sikh tradition, Sikh, and she talks about revolutionary love through the power of giving birth. It's powerful, it's traumatic, it made me, like, it gave the wells of emotions in me, it made me think. So don't go into this lightly, don't go into this half-heartedly, but if you want to check it out, it's powerful, beyond powerful about what a revolutionary love can look like. And she talks about like a family friend who was murdered after 9/11 simply by being a man of color in Arizona, is part of the story. And what that meant for the life of her and her family and for her community. And the power of what it looks like to respond with love and forgiveness and how it takes time. It's a powerful, powerful TED Talk. I really love this quote by Barbara Brown Taylor. I asked God for religious certainty, and God gave me relationships instead. I asked for solid ground, and God gave me human beings instead. Strange, funny, compelling, complicated human beings who keep puncturing my stereotypes, challenge my ideas and upsetting my ideas about God so that they are always under construction. We talked about evangelism and what evangelism looks like and how that's really important to Christianity. It really is. I am not downplaying evangelism. My pastoral internship supervisor would be really mad at me if I said evangelism was bad. She used to be the director of evangelism in the ELCA. But maybe it means we need to re-envision what evangelism looks like. Maybe we need to see evangelism as working on ourselves first, loving ourselves enough to be a disciple of Christ, to live fully into who God is calling us as a disciple of Christ, and then sharing that with others. That maybe it's not about salvation, but maybe it's about love. Because God is the one who gives us salvation, and God gives us love. So do you want to know the best way to create a disciple of Christ? It's to be one. To be the best disciple that you can be. And through that, questions will come up. It's not about denying who you are as a Christian, but it's about being confident in who you are as a Christian and letting that lead your life. And when people ask, wow, how do you love so deeply? You can say, well, my faith. I mean, Jesus tells the people, Jesus in all of his stories never says, your belief in me has made you well. Jesus says your faith has made you well. So what does that mean to fully live into your faith? And I think that this is an increasingly important conversation to have because we have millennials and Generation Z. There are many of them in our community who have never been inside a church. I hear this especially from older generations when they ask me, like, my kids don't go to church anymore. What do I do about that? And these are questions that are rooted in love. They're really great questions to ask. I am not discrediting them at all. But maybe the best way to approach them is to, one, be the best disciple that you can be. To be the awesome family member or parent that you can be and to live out this love. And then when these questions of faith arise or you want to approach the topic of why don't you go to church anymore, be prepared to listen more than you speak. Especially with millennials and Gen Z, they're looking for relationships. That has been one of the things that they have shown in the generational studies, but they don't want to be talked at. They want to be talked to. And so in recognizing, hearing the stories of why they don't go to church anymore, it might be difficult, and it might not lead to a response that you want. But that the way that faith can shape us can be through lived experiences and maybe give way to how the church can be in the future. We talk about the church changing. We don't know what it's changing into. I go to pastor conferences. I was at one yesterday, and they talk about the change of the church, and they say, here's all the ways that the church is changing, and not one of them has ever given me a way of how, like, what we can do about it. But I really think that's through conversations and through relationships and through being the best disciple that you can be and doing your own work so that you can love yourself and love this world that God has created. That will always spill over because the world, quite honestly, could never have too much love. Real, authentic love. Not forced love or fake love, but real, authentic love. One of the last things that she gave, one of the last stories she gave in the book that I really love is there's no such thing as religion. There are only religious people who embody the scripts of their faiths as differently as dancers embody the steps of their dances. Until someone grabs a partner and heads to the dance floor, the tango is no more than a list of steps on the wall. The same is true of faith. We have inherited a sacred pattern, a series of artful steps meant to lead us closer to God and each other. But until someone finds a partner and gives it a try, it is an idea, not a dance. And maybe all we can do is dance our hearts out, finding as much to admire in other dancers as we do with those who dance with us. And I'll leave you at that. Thank you so much for this time.